Hi, everyone. I'm glad you're here because today's episode is a doozy. Today, I have three stories that nearly shattered everyone involved as they tried to rationalize what happened to them. Just wait until you hear what you're about to hear. So, if you're enjoying the channel, don't be invisible. Let us know you're out there and smash that subscribe button so we can always be together. Thanks. Now, let's get into the stories. I used to think that people who claimed to have seen things were always on the wrong side of the crazy fence. Aliens, monsters, cryptids. I mean, if they exist, then where are they all hiding? The world isn't such a big place that all these things are just hanging around with no real evidence. Well, I don't think that way anymore. I have my own story to tell, and it happened in, of all places, Queens, New York. I'm a patrol officer, still a rookie. I spend most of my nights walking down Jamaica Avenue, breaking up bar fights and shooing off loiterers. More of a glorified security, really. Despite the city's bad rap, I've never seen anything more violent than a few broken bones or knife cuts. I joined the force with the intent to protect and serve. I know that sentiment is slowly fading, but I truly believed I could make a difference. So that's why when I was alone patrolling one night, I jumped at my chance to try to be a hero. I had only a few hours left in my shift when a woman shouted at me from across the street and dodged her way through traffic to rush over at me. She was screaming that she had seen a woman dragged into an alley just up the block. She refused to come with me but gave a rough description of the alleyway and the nearby buildings. So this is where I messed up. I should have called it in and asked for assistance. I wasn't even supposed to be alone, but I had let my partner cut out for an hour so that he could have dinner with his kids. Instead, I raced down the street feeling like John McClane and ready to save this lady's life. I wasn't prepared for what was about to happen. I reached the head of the alleyway and regained a small sense of clarity, meaning I was now starting to wonder what I was doing. I didn't know how many guys were waiting down this alley or even if that woman knew what she was talking about, if what she said was true. I poked my head around the corner and I could see that the alley was longer than I had thought. It looked like it ran a couple of 100 feet and ended at a high chain-link fence at the far end. Rubbish bags and dumpsters lined both sides of it, and a lot of my vision was obscured. I began to slowly walk down the path, and after a few feet, I could hear a strange grunting sound coming from behind a large dumpster. Fearing the worst, I drew my pistol and quickened my pace. Just as I rounded the corner, I heard a snapping sound, like a chicken bone being broken in half or something. And that's when I was met with a sight that is forever branded into my memory. A woman lay sprawled on the ground, bleeding from a trio of wounds on her thigh and shoulder, and someone was hunched over her, holding her left arm and obscuring it from my view. It looked like some filthy robe covered the whole guy, and the smell, which I had originally chalked up to the garbage, was nauseatingly putrid. I shouted for the guy to stand up and turn around, now, and at the sound of my voice, he snapped away from the woman's body and ran over to the wall and put his back against it, facing me. This is when I finally saw its face. Its skin was sickly gray, flecked with splotches of olive color. Its eyes were two thin strips of pupilless yellow, and it had only a single slit for a nose and a pair of cracked lips. This thing didn't even look like it could be alive. It stared at me, obviously caught off guard by my sudden arrival. And now, with my bravado lost, I tried to issue another order for the creature to get down on the ground, but it came out like a pathetic whisper. The thing must have sensed some momentary weakness in me because after waiting a brief moment, it bared 2 rows of needle-thin teeth and launched itself at me from the wall. I don't even know when I raised my pistol. My hands were shaking almost uncontrollably. But I let out 2 shots from my gun, and I swear I saw both impacts on the thing's chest. But it didn't slow down a bit. The last thing I saw was a dirty gray hand swinging towards my head, and everything faded to black. I think I was only out for a few moments. My cell phone was ringing loudly in my pocket, and I got myself up. My head felt like a lightning bolt had gone through it, and it took a minute for everything to sink back in. Looking over and seeing the woman laid out on the ground hammered the scenario home. I ran over to her and thanked God she was still breathing, but unconscious. Reality sank in on just how horrible this situation was, and I knew I needed to call it in. Within a few moments, a bus arrived, as well as a handful of other officers and a detective. I received treatment for my head, and then I was asked a series of questions. Needless to say, both my partner and I were in a lot of trouble. I'm looking at a possible suspension for acting so rashly, and my partner is probably going to lose his job for being AWOL. Both of these things pale in comparison to what the woman experienced. She had several fractures on her legs and arms, and I knew that the wounds that I saw were bite marks. She was in rough shape, but the hospital said she would make it through. As far as the thing that did it, well, the sketch artist had a rough time. I described it the best I could, even though they gave me some side-eye with my description. But I know that whatever it wasn't human. I just hope that somebody catches that thing before it hurts someone else. I don't know how I get myself into these situations. I mean, I don't even like to go camping. So many times I've tried, and I just end up being cold and wet and uncomfortable. Also, I hate to admit it, but I barely know what to do with myself anymore when I don't have an internet connection. But I don't mind renting a cabin on occasion. I've found plenty of them that have electricity and even Wi-Fi sometimes, but I have this loyalty to a couple of my childhood friends, and they love camping. Especially the kind of camping where you have to hike in to get to your spot. So, every once in a while, I let them talk me into it. They convinced me to go with them during one of our college breaks. Maybe it was because I was the one with the fancy tent. I had inherited it from my brother when he upgraded to an even bigger one. He had 2 kids and a wife, so he needed a lot more room. My friends had their eye on this place in the Great Smoky Mountains. The plan was for a 3-day trip with a lot of hiking in and camping and hiking out. It really was too cold for my liking, but things were going okay the first day. It was a sunny day in spite of the temperature. We did plenty of drinking that first night and had a blast laughing and talking, and when I was laying in the tent that night looking up at the stars, it was almost pleasant. But the next morning, it was cloudy and it kept raining on and off. I was trying to pack up and everything was getting soggy, and I was getting grouchy. If it had been raining steadily, I could probably have convinced the others to shorten the trip, but the sun kept peeking out and pretending like it was going to actually turn into a nice day. The rain turned into a mist that my friends thought was cool and kept saying how it would be fine. But during the afternoon, the temperature really dropped, and I couldn't even pretend to be having fun. I stopped walking and said I wasn't going any further. And since I had the only tent, they could either stay with me or go on without a shelter. Obviously, they stayed. We got the tent up and a fire going to dry out our clothes. At least we had more wine to raise our spirits, and the rain was holding off. We were trying to get into a jovial mood, but one of my friends started acting a little weird and nervous, and kept looking off into the woods. It was starting to make me nervous too. I asked her what she was looking at, but she just said she felt a little off and kind of creeped out. Well, that didn't help my mood, and I got paranoid. The Great Smoky Mountains are known for having plenty of black bears. I had heard that they were mostly harmless, especially if their cubs weren't threatened. I wasn't interested in taking any chances, though, and there were plenty of other things that could be hiding in the woods. We decided that since the weather had been so wet lately, it wasn't likely that anything would catch fire. So we left the fire burning a little and went into the tent. And it still wasn't raining, so we left the tent flap a little unzipped to be able to keep an eye on the fire. I was really sleepy though, so I guess I dozed off right away. But it seemed like only a few minutes had gone by, and I jolted out of my sleep and sat straight up. I thought for sure that I had heard something moving outside the tent. I looked at my friends. They were wide awake too. We looked out at the glow of the fire. The embers had burned down pretty low. I was straining my eyes and I thought I could make out antlers just outside the tree line. I wanted to feel relief at the thought that it was only a deer. But for some reason, that sight made me feel ice cold to the core of my being. It made absolutely no sense. I had no fear of deer. It looked like it was stepping a little closer towards us, and when I saw the shape emerge, I was horrified. It couldn't be a deer because it was standing upright, and it seemed 8 feet tall, maybe. I wanted to scream or cry, but instead I just shut down. I saw these yellow eyes come glowing out of the darkness, and they seemed to be embedded in the skull of a deer. I had this weird thought that some devil creature had stolen the deer skull and was wearing it for its own evil purposes. There's also this terrible smell of rotten flesh that drifted over to us, and we looked at each other like this was the end. When I looked at the thing, it actually seemed like it was dead, like some rotting corpse that was somehow walking around. It looked like it had tattered flesh hanging off of it. But the worst part was how it made me feel hollowed out, and I had the sense that I was possessed with a demonic hunger that could never be appeased. What happened then was so weird. We all spontaneously took hands and closed our eyes and started to pray. Let me tell you, there wasn't one religious bone in any of our bodies. I hadn't been in a church since I was 12. My one friend looked and started describing how she could see a luminous protective light surrounding our tent. She was sure that it was an impenetrable light through which evil could not enter. We must have stayed in that circle together in the tent for 20 minutes, and eventually the desolate feeling withdrew and everything was back to normal. I don't know what more to say. The whole experience was mind-blowing, and I was left with some kind of a faith that I still can't define. This is an odd story. I tell this story at least once a year, usually at the bar because I've had too much to drink. Also, no, I was not drinking at the time. That seems to be the follow-up question every time I tell it. Luckily, also, I was not the only person to experience what happened. My sister and 2 of my friends were there as well, and they can completely back me up. This happened a few years ago. We were getting ready for a big Halloween party. It wasn't on Halloween, it was the weekend before. We usually throw a big party though, since Halloween is big in our family. We're of Irish descent, so anything related to the Irish, like Halloween, we blow it up big time. We spent most of the day hanging decorations throughout the house. We had already hung lights and put some stuff up outside, inflatables and a couple of dummies. One was a scarecrow sitting on the bench outside. We had a witch. They all turned out great. I also had just bought a bunch of firewood and I made a giant stack next to the pit outside. People started coming over around 6 or 7. The first few hours we had a ton of people show up. But you know, as the night progresses, people come and go to other parties, and they might come back later. The later it got, the smaller the party got, until eventually around midnight there was maybe 15 or 20 of us. Some were in the house, some outside around the fire. We have a pretty big property. Not huge, but it goes way back. And there's a tree line at the very back that leads to a park. At one point in the night, we heard something fall over in the shed, and the noise freaked a few people out. So a few of my friends and I went to investigate. We used our phones as flashlights and we walked back to the shed. The shed is about halfway between our house and the back of the property by the trees. When we got back there, I slowly opened the door and we flashed our lights and looked inside. A bunch of stuff had fallen. Tools, yard equipment. They were all over the place. It was weird, but it made sense and explained why it had been so loud. The only way you can get into the shed, though, is through the one door, and it was shut when we walked up to it. One of my friends suggested that things were probably not as secure as we had thought when we got things out of there earlier, and then they fell and dragged the rest of the stuff down, or something like that. I closed the door and we walked back to the fire pit and basically just forgot about it. A few more hours go by and more people start to leave. It's about 2 in the morning at this point. I walk with 2 of my friends to their cars and we hear something shuffling in the dark. We stop and I shine my phone at my friend's Jeep. Something moves next to the wheel of the Jeep. I turned the light off to see if it would come out again, and I just stood there with my friends for a few minutes. I then turned the light back on and shined it towards the wheel. Standing there is this little humanoid thing, and it ducks back toward the Jeep wheel. We all saw it, but nobody could get a good look at it at first. So I turned the light back off, and then we quietly moved forward a little bit. I turned the light back on, and the thing is still there. It had these big shiny eyes and little ears. Its arms and legs were long and thin, and I could see one of its little hands holding on to the tire. It seemed to have 6 slender fingers gripping into the grooves of the tread. It was shaking, and then one of my friends began to freak out, and the thing disappeared. We ran over to where it was, but now it was gone. We spent the next hour and a half looking all over the property for any signs of that little guy. We never found the thing. We looked over the area around the Jeep, too. There weren't any footprints or handprints on the Jeep or the tires. And that's when we remembered the shed. We moved quietly back to the shed and threw the doors open. There was nothing in there but the mess that we had seen earlier. We then thought about going back into the trees, but decided it would probably just be harder to look for something back there at this time of night. The next morning, though, my friends and my sister helped me go over the area again. And that's when we began to find some stuff. Weird stuff. Not near the Jeep, but next to my sister's car, there was this weird little pile of acorns. Only about 4 or 5 of them, kind of stacked next to her tire. And then we found a wad of string under my friend's Ford Taurus. There was about 2 feet of it, wadded up in a ball. We brought the things into the house and showed my other friends who didn't believe us when we told them the night before. They still didn't believe us. They thought we were messing with them because of Halloween. I decided to sit outside at night for the next 2 weeks. It was tough, but I stayed awake for most of those nights. 2 of my friends who saw it came over and hung outside with me too, but we never did see anything. Sometimes when I find weird stuff, it reminds me of that night. My sister never wants to talk about it. My friends and I who saw it, though, have told a few people. Most don't believe what we're saying. I don't know what we saw or if it will ever come back, but I think about that little thing often. Have you ever heard of a creature that fits this description? Please let me know.